No problem I faced while I was President of the United States was more controversial or more complex than the problem of Israel.
Israel is exercising its right to defend its borders.
Right to self-defense! Right to self-defense!
Today they killed 7 more Palestinians. These are people who are peacefully demonstrating, demanding freedom and showing solidarity with them.
Free Palestine! Freedom for Palestine! Freedom for Palestine!
It's more than 25 years since Israel and the Palestinians agreed to make peace. But right now, as many see it, actual peace seems more out of reach than ever.
My name's Clara, and this is Sandstone. Sandstone is a storytelling podcast that seeks to understand the nuanced worlds of Arabia and Appalachia, and the people that call these places home. Last time on Sandstone, we examined the parallel histories of the Middle East and Appalachia, interrogating the past to understand today. In this episode, we'll zoom in to a specific historical conflict that remains a salient issue in modern politics. For most of my life, I didn't know much about Israel-Palestine. I knew that there was a wall there that wailed, and a sea that was dead. Politicians seemed to like Israel, and my very religious grandmother, she loved the place. I knew there was a conflict, but beyond that, I felt pretty indifferent toward the whole thing. But in college, I decided to take a class on the history of Israel-Palestine, mostly because whenever anyone mentioned the topic, I felt entirely lost and left out of the conversation. So I took this class right around the time the U.S. moved its embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
Next week, we will finally open the American Embassy in Jerusalem.
Friends and family members interrogated me. What's the big deal? Why are people so upset about this? It's just an embassy. And thankfully, I had just taken my final exam, so I could kind of answer them. But still, this was concerning. Why were full-grown adults asking me, a mere youth, to explain a conflict that's been around for nearly a century? Sound the alarms. We need to talk. Like most of you, I've never been to Israel or Palestine. And since I can't speak from my own personal experience on this topic, I'm going to bring in some people who can. In part 1, we'll hear from Middle East researcher Nicholas Brumfield from the last episode, and we'll hear from a team of activist filmmakers engaged in the region. In part 2, we'll meet a Palestinian family who will share with us what life is really like on the ground. And if history is just not your thing, feel free to hop on over to the story in part 2. But I would recommend listening to this one first. To begin, let's back her up a bit. Keep coming, okay? Keep it coming. Now cut it hard. Stop. You're good. Welcome to the sweet year of 70 AD. AD, as in apple dumpling. It wasn't actually that sweet for the Jews, honestly. Around 70 AD, the Jewish people were driven from the Holy Land, expelled by the Romans, and scattered all over Africa, Asia, and Europe. And the Jews in Europe suffered years of subsequent anti-Semitism, enduring expulsions, massacres, and persecution, just like all the terrible things. And at the end of the 1800s, there was an uptick in anti-Semitism throughout Europe, most visibly demonstrated in what were known as pogroms. Sounds like pilgrims. It's not. A pogrom is a Russian term meaning to wreak havoc, to demolish violently. The Jewish people were being demolished violently, and they were sick of it. They wanted out. And coinciding with this rampant anti-Semitism was a popular movement of nationalism in Europe. Prior to the 19th century, the idea of a nation wasn't super popular.
You had a king, the king had subjects.
This is Nicholas.
What language they spoke, what sort of ethnic group they were, wasn't terribly important to the king, as long as you paid your taxes and, you sort of did your duty.
But then the cool kids started making their own nations, and peer pressure is a real thing, so suddenly everyone wants to become a nation state. It's like the hot move of the day. And the Jews are like, we also want to have a nation, especially because there's like a lot of anti-Semitism going on, and we're being quite literally demolished violently. But the problem was, they didn't have a homeland.
There was intense debate over how Jews were supposed to be responding to both sort of nationalism and anti-Semitism in Europe at the time.
Jewish scholars, political and religious leaders, they offered answers, often disagreeing and debating. And in this context emerged the idea of Zionism, a movement to establish a homeland for the Jewish people.
Zionism was by and large a secular phenomenon run by sort of cultural Jewish people that didn't necessarily practice intense sort of religious commitment.
But where would this homeland be? You probably know the answer. But they did explore their options. They considered Uganda, Argentina, West Virginia. They didn't actually consider West Virginia. That was a test to see if you're still listening. Gotcha. Anyway, they did contemplate real estate around the world. But at the end of the day, Zionists settled on the land from which their people were expelled centuries prior, the land of Zion, the Promised Land, the place you now know as Israel.
So you got this in the 1880s and 90s. You start seeing various waves of migration from Europe, and you get basically European Jews in what is now Israel, Palestine, basically trying to do what the U.S. did in its early phases. They were trying to buy up land. They were trying to consolidate their territories. They were trying to create a national state in what they called, they were a people without a land in a land without a people. And ultimately, that was just false.
Now, the problem was, there were already people living in the Promised Land, majority Arab communities who had been living there for centuries.
There were people in Palestine. They were living their lives, so I'm sure they had problems, but they were doing all right. They were subjects of the Ottoman Empire, and so they were basically trying to displace this native population of Arabs and what are now Palestinians off the land in much the same way that the U.S. Sort of moved Indians off of land so that they could claim it and farm it and build industry and all this sorts of stuff. And so that went on in sort of one of the major turning points, and that was in 1917.
In 1917, Zionism achieved its first major win. Lord Balfour, this dude from the British cabinet, he signed the Balfour Declaration, officially declaring Britain's support of Jewish aspirations in Palestine. It was basically a green light for the Zionist plan. Things got more complicated during World War I. Confronted with the imminent fall of the Ottoman Empire, representatives of Great Britain and France got together in secret, spy club style, deciding that if the Allied powers win the war, we, Britain and France, will share the loot of the Ottoman Empire.
They decide that France, for instance, is going to get Syria. They carve off Lebanon to give Christians majority rule in that state so they can sort of rule it on their own. Britain is like, okay, we want Iraq because they have oil and because it can sort of give us a strategic advantage there. So we're also going to take Jordan and then obviously Israel and Palestine, or what was then known as the Mandate of Palestine.
When the Allied powers won the war, these spheres of influence became official mandates.
And over the course of the next 20 years or so, 20, 30 years, they administered these mandates, sort of how I was talking, trying to say that they're going to give control to the local people, but actually keeping control for themselves. Developing those areas such that they benefited French companies and British companies, and the Mandate of Palestine, which it was given to Britain after World War I, it allowed the British to say, okay, the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine was called the Yishuv at the time. We're going to basically let you build your own state structures. And then at the same time, they denied Palestinians the ability to do this.
So as you might expect, the Arabs in the region weren't exactly thrilled with the way things were going. The Jewish population was multiplying, and now the Brits were all up in their business. There were protests and sporadic confrontations, yet relative to the future, it was a predominantly peaceful time.
Following sort of World War II and sort of the realization of the horror of the Holocaust, then that's when you sort of get the widespread popular buy-in that, okay, there needs to be a state of Israel.
With the rise of Nazi Germany and the mass exodus of Jews from Europe into Palestine, things started to heat up between Jewish settlers and Palestinians. And while the international community recognized the growing tensions, it was agreed that Holocaust refugees needed sanctuary, and that sanctuary would be Palestine. Things were getting real messy, and the British were starting to sweat. So they hit up the United Nations, and they're like, we got in over our heads, please do something. So in 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine between Jews and Arabs, and immediately armed conflict ensued. Israelis call the subsequent war the heroic War of Independence. Palestinians call it the Nakba, the catastrophe.
During which time the surrounding Arab states in the Middle East and Israel went to war, and the Palestinians were in there too, but they didn't have a state. And 750,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed. I mean, and that is the technical term from Israel, and they were sort of forced. A lot of them were forced, a lot of them fled out of fear, and then they didn't let them come back.
When Palestinians tried to come back to their homes, they were barred from entry, and they'll tell you stories of their olive trees and orchards and how they still have the keys to their homes, but the locks have long since been changed. In 1967, Israel furthered its control of Palestinian land, illegally occupying Palestinian territories.
And under international law, Gaza and the Palestinian territories in the West Bank, or known as the Palestinian territories, are not part of Israel. They're not supposed to be part of Israel.
At this point, Israel was a new state, fresh out of the nationhood womb. So how did they achieve such military success in the region?
They had 20 or 30 years to develop a state. So they had an army in a way that the Palestinians didn't in 1947, 1948. They almost always had an external backer, so that was originally France. That sort of gave the Israelis weapons to sort of fight off the Arabs. And then after 1967, in the context of the Cold War, America's like, okay, now we need a client in the Middle East because we're up against the Soviet Union. We need someone there who can do stuff. And it was after the 1967 war that the United States was like, okay, Israel can be our guy.
Today, around 4.5 million Palestinians live in the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza, with millions of refugees displaced around the world. They still talk about going home, but by law, the right of return is denied to Palestinians. In Jordan, it's estimated that over half of the population is of Palestinian origin, and even if they were born in Jordan and have never been to Palestine, the vast majority still identify as Palestinian. And refugee camps that were intended to be temporary have become established towns and villages, permanent fixtures in Jordanian society.
It's not about religion. This is not a Judaism versus Islam thing or Judeo-Christianity versus Islam. It is fundamentally about who controls the land that is Israel-Palestine, and the sort of fundamental disconnect there is Jewish-Israeli fears of insecurity and understandably so of anti-Semitism, and sort of Palestinian demands for justice and for being able to determine their own futures in their own country, which they haven't been able to do for about the last 70 years.
But what does this conflict look like today? And why is it relevant to the average American? Today's very special guests, Emma and Suhad, will help answer these questions.
So my name is Suhad Baba, and I'm the Executive Director of Just Vision.
I'm Emma Alpert. I'm the Director of Public Engagement for Just Vision.
Just Vision is an organization of multinational human rights advocates, journalists, and filmmakers dedicated to peace and justice in Palestine and Israel. I met Suhad and Emma during their visit to Morgantown, West Virginia, where they screened their new film, Naila and the Uprising, an animated film illustrating the role of women activists in Palestine. Suhad's father is Palestinian, and during the War of 1967, he was made a refugee from his homeland.
My father's family lived in Tulkarem, which is a community in the West Bank. During that period, the military basically took over the town and told its residents that you are either allowed to get on a cattle herd truck. It was literally a truck that was used to herd cattle, and we will take you to a camp in Jordan, or you can stay here and we'll make sure that your lives are miserable. And that was the experience of my father.
Suhad holds an intimate understanding of the conflict from her own experience as a Palestinian American and having lived in Israel-Palestine. Emma's story is different.
I was born in Texas, moved around a lot. I come from a big family, grew up Presbyterian, having a very sort of cursory understanding of the Middle East. And it wasn't until I was in college studying photojournalism that I ended up taking a trip to Israel-Palestine, sort of by accident. And it was my first time in the region, and it was really transformative.
As an American unfamiliar with the conflict, Emma was shocked by the reality on the ground.
You know, when you look at a map of the Middle East, you sort of have these understanding of borders and communities and different states. And when you're in Israel-Palestine, it really feels very different.
For Palestinians in the occupied territories, movement is strictly regulated. Barriers, physical, political, and psychological, separate communities and divide the land.
You have, for example, a wall it's a kind of series of concrete walls and fences that was built by the Israeli government starting in the early 2000s. That was argued to be a security wall or a security apparatus.
In some places, it's as high as 8 meters, making it twice the height of the Berlin Wall. It runs 280 miles long, basically the distance between Philadelphia and Boston.
To build what it calls a security barrier intended to stop attacks. The Palestinians call it the apartheid wall.
In reality, that kind of series of walls and fences actually encroach into Palestinian lands, and many Palestinians see it as a vehicle to grab lands.
On their daily commutes, Palestinians regularly pass through military checkpoints secured by Israeli defense forces.
The journey from Jerusalem to Ramallah, which should be a fairly easy 15 to 20 minute journey, for Palestinians, you can be at that checkpoint for 20 minutes, an hour, sometimes hours upon hours, at the whim of whoever is kind of guarding that post for the day, whether they want to shut it down or open it up or what have you. Palestinians are supposed to use certain roads, and there are separate roads for Jewish Israeli settlers who live in internationally illegal settlements that have been built, Jewish-only settlements that have been built around all over the West Bank.
There were just over 200,000 in 1990. Now the number is 3 times bigger. Settlers are seen as illegal under international law.
Gaza and the West Bank are geographically isolated from each other, and they experience the occupation in different ways.
In Gaza, you have a very different scenario where Palestinians who live in Gaza live under a military siege. Water, air, and land borders are completely controlled by the State of Israel. Palestinians have to request a permit to be able to leave Gaza. In most cases, those permits are denied. Our colleagues who we've been working with for years who are living in Gaza, I've never been able to see them personally. We've done our entire body of work with them virtually, despite every effort to try to get in and out. That's another kind of means of kind of controlling movement to this kind of what is an open-air land prison.
Beyond the occupied territories, there are still Palestinian communities within Israel, about 20% of the population.
So they are a minority that are often treated as second-class citizens. And while the kind of separation and segregation looks different for Palestinians in Israel than in the West Bank and Gaza, you do have separate education systems. You have Jewish-only communities where Palestinians who are trying to buy or rent homes aren't allowed in, either by practice or by law. And the list goes on in terms of kind of the levels and layers of separation that is forced and systematic.
Now you might be thinking, Israel is just trying to protect itself. If there weren't walls or checkpoints, Israeli security would be compromised. Yet in the name of security, Palestinians are stripped of their rights.
We often think about when the language of security is used in the Israeli-Palestinian context, we're often looking at it through the lens of the military and the police being the keepers of security, right? The enforcers of security. When in fact, what that often translates into for Palestinian lives is that they are the recipients of state-sanctioned violence.
Often when Israel perpetuates violence, it's deemed to be self-defense, a state-sanctioned act to protect the security of Israeli citizens. Yet when Palestinians commit violent acts, it's considered terrorism, a heinous act of aggression. Now, for the record, I don't like either. Violence isn't my thing. But it does make you question things. If civilians are killed in both scenarios, why is one violence more redeemable than the other?
Part of our work is directly to readjust and kind of provide a more holistic view of how we think about security, whose security, through what means, and how do we actually build safe societies. And it's part of the reason that Just Vision exists, to tell the stories of those communities who are organizing nonviolently through the lens of the grassroots leaders who are part of it. We as a society choose where we pay attention. And we can either continue to pay attention to those actors who are toxic, violent, problematic, extremists, and what have you. Or we can actually look to the people who are doing something transformative, meaningful, values-driven.
So let's try this out. We're going to choose right now where we pay attention. In part 2, we'll meet a family from Gaza, a family who has experienced the occupation firsthand.
It's hard for us to even travel to anywhere, even in Palestine, because Israel controls us.
Next time on Sandstone. This project is supported in part by the Critical Language Scholarship Alumni Development Fund. The Critical Language Scholarship Program is sponsored by the U.S. Department of State, with funding provided by the U.S. government. Thank you for listening.